Hi, Sean.
Hi.
How you doing?
Yeah, not bad. Are we videos on or off?
On during the when you're speaking. You're going last, by the way.
Okay, cool. So off apart from when I'm speaking.
Yeah. And have you got a presentation? You doing any slides?
I have, yeah, just a few, if that's okay.
Yeah, perfect. So you'll just be able to share your. You've got the sharing.
I know how to share. Yeah, I'm good with that. If you're happy for me to be able to share.
Yeah, perfect.
Fantastic. Hi, Edmund, and hi, whoever else that is. I can't quite see whoever else that is.
Okay, here. Hi there, Sean.
YouTube's fine.
Good to see. I'll go off then and speak to you in a bit.
Great, thanks.
Cheers.
Adam, where am I in the lineup, please?
You're now first, Rachel.
Okay.
Yeah.
Over and done with. Thank you.
Hi, Andy.
Hi, are you okay? Can you hear me all right?
Yeah, all good.
Great, thank you.
Okay.
Right, welcome everybody. Sorry, a bit weird. Welcome everybody to All Party Parliamentary Group on walking and cycling. We called today's meeting because we're really keen to address the issue of the highway code, which we welcome the changes to, but the fact that there's an issue about the publicity of it. And we want, how they're communicated and what we can do and what needs to be done to ensure that people adhere to a code. Many people don't even know about the new changes. We've got a great lineup of speakers, but it's not quite as we'd originally planned, because we were to have Laura Hill from the Department of Transport. We heard about an hour ago that they weren't able to have a representative here, which is disappointing, because actually, having the DFT here, I think would have been pretty vital, because the highway code is, in a sense, theirs to own and promote. But anyway, so we've got Duncan Dollymore, head of campaigns at Cycling UK. Hello. In the room, and Edmund King, OBE president of the AA, Automobile Association. Welcome. We've got Andy Cox. Hello, Andy. Hi, Andy. Detective Chief Superintendent, OCU Commander, Strategy and Transformation Group at the Metropolitan Police. That's kind of a mouthful, but welcome, Andy. Rachel Botterill, Senior Associate Solicitor at Lee Day. And Sean Hellman, Chief Scientist, Behavioural Sciences at TRL. So we might as well say we were first going to go to Laura Hill from the DFT, but we'll go to Rachel. And could I just also ask all participants who are online to please put your questions in the Q&A, not in the chat function. Okay, many thanks. All right, over to you, Rachel.
Thank you. So hopefully everybody can see my screen. Please let me know if not. So thank you for the introduction. I'm a senior solicitor at Lee Day and also a keen cyclist. And just briefly, for those who don't know who Lee Day are, we are lawyers for a large number of cyclists and pedestrians pursuing civil actions after being involved in road traffic collisions. We do claimant work only, so we don't act for any motorists or motor insurers. We provide legal services to British Cycling and British Triathlon, and we're also corporate members of the APPCG. So I'll be focusing on cycling cases for this talk because that's my area of specialism. So the question posed today is whether we are seeing any positive or negative patterns emerging from a legal perspective as a result of the changes to the highway code. And obviously I'm looking at this from a civil perspective. I'm sure Andy will look at it from the criminal side. So it might help very quickly to explain a bit about the legal process. So if a cyclist is injured in a road traffic collision, they can instruct a solicitor to deal with their action for damages, aka compensation. We spend some time investigating a case in terms of both liability and quantifying or valuing a case, so we don't issue court proceedings immediately upon instruction. So for that reason, as I'll come to address, we haven't fully tested the impact of these changes in the civil legal system yet. So the first thing that we do in these types of cases is send what's called a pre-action letter of claim, or in lower value cases, we have to put the cases through a kind of a fast track portal. And this is where we can set out our preliminary allegations of negligence against, for example, a motorist who has knocked a cyclist off. And we use this opportunity to set out sections of the highway code, and the changes have been very helpful to us in this regard, particularly some of the new wording, the very specific wording, which I will run through briefly. So some of the highway code provisions that we are using the most, Rule 140, I won't read the whole thing, but it's about cycle lanes and cycle tracks. And in terms of giving way to cyclists who are using them, don't cut across them, be prepared to stop and wait for a safe gap. And also bear in mind that cyclists aren't obliged to use these cycle lanes. And these might sound obvious, but we do see a lot of collisions occurring in cycle lanes, often where cars have turned across them without checking if they're clear or not. The previous highway code said that cyclists should use cycle routes where practicable and keep within cycle lanes wherever possible. And there has been case law in the past, so previous judicial decisions where claimants have been penalised for not using a cycle lane. And that is to say that they have lost a percentage of their overall damages award. So the progression of the wording now allows us to bat away some of those arguments that motorists might put forward, that we do still see occasionally. If there was a cycle lane there, they should have used it. Rule 163 is another one that we're using a lot about dangerous overtakes and close passes, and it's really helpful now to be able to point out the precise distance that should be left between a motorist when overtaking a cyclist. I was recently instructed in a case where a cyclist was close passed by a bus travelling at speed on a 60-mile-per-hour road. So this new provision about leaving more than 1.5 metres was obviously set out very clearly in the letter of claim that we sent on that case. Rule 66 about riding two abreast when it's safer to do so, and also Rules 72 and 213 about road positioning and using the primary position to ride in the centre of your lane and make yourself as visible as possible. And to keep 0.5 metre away from the curb edge. Those are all really valuable bits of wording that we can use. We often face criticism from defendants where our clients have been riding in the middle of the road or riding two abreast. We know as cyclists that they're doing that to protect themselves, and now we've got the ammunition to come back at any defendant who tries to challenge that. Rule 239, which is the car dooring rule. We are still seeing car dooring cases. We had one in last week in London. So we're using the new wording, and obviously the Dutch reach method is set out in there. But the fact that we're still seeing these cases suggests that the message is not filtering through to motorists yet, and I'm sure other panelists will talk about whether or not people are taking heed of the new provisions or not. Rule 151 is another one which is very useful in civil claims, because we see a great number of collisions occurring where cyclists are filtering through slow-moving traffic. 178 about the advanced stop lines, allowing cyclists enough time and space to move off when the lights change, and that drivers of large vehicles should stop sufficiently far behind the white line so they can see the whole area of cyclists waiting. Again, traffic lights and junctions give rise to a lot of the cases that we do, so these are really helpful to quote, particularly where HGVs have come into contact with cyclists after waiting at a set of traffic lights. And these types of cases, as you can imagine, tend to be of the utmost severity in terms of the injuries sustained by the cyclists. So very helpful now to have these improved provisions. And the other, well, there's two more. The roundabouts one, again, we see cases on roundabouts. So we've been using that one quite a lot in our letters of claim. And there's also obviously the hierarchy of road users, which enshrines long-standing legal principles of causative potency and relative blameworthiness, which we've been using in civil actions for a long time. And now we can quote the hierarchy of road users from the new highway code. And it's actually a provision that we often end up quoting where a cyclist and a motor vehicle have met on a narrow or country road, because there's obviously not many witnesses, and it's about who is most blameworthy in that situation. So I think summarise that, we have been using the new provisions many times over in our letters of claim, which we send to opponents, so motorists, insurance companies usually. And we are starting to see the new provisions being referenced in cases where we get collision reconstruction experts on board, in cases where liability is contested. But in terms of seeing these provisions moving through the courts, we don't usually issue court proceedings in these types of cases until several years down the line, in cases where either liability and or quantum, so the value of the case, remain in dispute. So it's at that stage when you issue court proceedings that you draft your formal allegations of negligence into a document known as the particulars of claim, and that would include these new provisions. So we obviously can't speak on behalf of all law firms, but due to this delay between being instructed in a new case and actually issuing it in court, we haven't seen the new provisions tested in front of a judge yet in the civil system. Sorry, as I turn my page over. So yeah, we only see things when they have gone wrong. But we feel positive about the changes, and undoubtedly they are helping us to set our cases out in the civil system. In terms of what's happening on the ground, I'm sure other panelists will deal with this in more detail, but we have seen no reduction in the number of cases coming in following the changes. But that could be masked by an increase in people cycling or increased awareness of the ability to bring a claim. So it might be that we report back in another year or two to see if there's any noticeable impact on our area of work. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Rachel. Thanks very much, Rachel. That was really useful. And I think there's some changes for pedestrians, but we'll come on to that in Q&A when we have time at the end. So can I ask Duncan Dollymore, who's head of campaigns at Cycling UK.
Thank you very much, Chair. Good evening, everyone. Well, Cycling UK campaigned and lobbied for well over 10 years for changes to the Highway Code. So we were delighted when they were brought in last January. I wish I could be a little bit more positive about the impact we thought it was having on behaviour on the roads. Unfortunately, there's an absence of data or even what I would call anecdotal information to say that it's having much impact yet. I say the word yet because I think that's a crucially important one, because we remain of the view that these changes have the potential to be very positive. But there were always four things that were needed with these changes. One, we needed a change to the rules and the framework, as it were, which we've got, and we think they're excellent. The second was communication of those changes, and we don't think we've had enough of that yet. The third was not just communication of the changes, but an understanding of the rationale for them, and we definitely haven't had that yet. And the fourth was perhaps that filtering into a consistent approach to, as it were, roads policing and enforcement of those. I'm sure Andy will talk about that. We have some pockets of excellence in relation to that, but I think there's still a bit to do in terms of filtering all these things through in relation to how things are consistently dealt with across forces. On the knowledge of changes, when it got to a year anniversary this January of them coming in, we did some YouGov surveys in relation to matters, asking the same questions that were asked exactly a year ago when the changes were brought in. Disappointingly, but not surprisingly, there wasn't much change in terms of people's knowledge of the changes. And even when people said that they knew there had been some changes, their accuracy or knowledge of exactly what the changes was pretty poor. I think it's really important to say at this stage, huge credit to the Department for Transport for pushing through some changes which some thought were controversial. And their messaging in terms of their latest campaign, Travel Like You Know Them, which is designed to make people think about others on the roads, is a very good message. Our concern really is in relation to the resource that's been given to the think team to actually push these changes out. Everybody listening into this today will know that the consequences of fatalities on our roads cannot be measured in financial terms alone. But if you'll forgive me, just to deal with the pure financial estimate the DFT give to every death on the road, it's £2.1 million loss for every death. And we have over 1,600 each year on the roads. Yet the budget to communicate these changes is less than that by a substantial amount. And I think that goes to the core of the lack of resource that's been given to communicate the changes. But it's also relevant to the issue of communicating the reasons for the changes. I had a fascinating conversation with Emily Cherry from the Bikeability Trust the other week, who was telling me about a conversation they had in the office that delivered some bikeability training to a young boy who had gone back and explained to his father where he should be cycling on the road. And his father had gone berserk and phoned up the Bikeability Trust the following day and spent over an hour lambasting the director of the Bikeability Trust about how he didn't understand anything, before it was patiently explained that actually it wasn't the best thing for the young boy to hug the curb, and this had been the guidance for some time. But that just goes to the core, I think, of a lack of understanding of the rationale for some of the things that are in the highway code. And it's not just enough to say, this is the change, you must comply. There's also an exercise of explaining the rationale. And we haven't really got to that particular point. It struck me when I read one of Jeremy Vine's recent tweets, and I read one of the comments, there was somebody saying, if he'd been the left gutter, then he would have had sufficient space. And I think that goes to the issue of the failure to understand that some of these changes can't be just communicated as one rule. There's a contextual thing as to why these changes were necessary. The best example of that is perhaps the hierarchy of road user responsibilities, which is a concept that's been introduced. Just explaining that as one rule doesn't really mean much to people. It has to be explained in the context of why some of these changes are being introduced to better protect the most vulnerable on our roads. One of my counterparts in another charity, Alan Hiscox from the British Horse Society, they've done lots of work about overtaking of horse riders. And when he's dealing with this subject, he often mentions the Benjamin Franklin quote, which is, tell me and I'll forget, teach me and I may remember, involve me and I will understand. And there hasn't been enough of that involving in some of these changes. And the consequence of that is we've had information that's been effectively given to people, or people have assimilated via media coverage. And that's not always been particularly helpful, because it's led to polarized media coverage and to polarized discussions. And one of the things, as a final plea from me, which would be very, very helpful to try and move on from that, relates, I think, to ministers and the Department for Transport actively supporting and talking about the rationale of these changes. I'm sitting next to Ed from the AA who's following me, but it has sometimes felt over the last year that it's fallen to representative bodies to justify the changes.
Yeah.
Multiple interviews involving people like myself and Ed trying to explain why these changes were necessary and what the benefit was. And it would be nice to see a bit of government shouting about something they've actually achieved themselves, which they deserve credit for bringing these in. But it does need a bit of a bolder foot forward to say, and we did it because, and these could be the benefits of this. And so that's the final plea from me in relation to this. Hope that doesn't sound too negative. We remain of the view that these changes are something which would have potentially huge benefits, but there does need to be greater communication, better understanding, and better self-promotion of them. And I think that's it from me.
Great, thanks so much, Duncan. And over to Edmund King. And it's, I don't know whether I can't remember if you've been to Walking Cycling or Party Group before, but it's good to welcome you here.
Thank you very much.
Over to you.
Yeah, thanks very much, Chair. And for those questioning why someone from the Automobile Association might be talking about cycling, I've had a long interest in cycling since my mother bought my first bike, a rally bike, for £5 from Colin Chapman, the founder of Lotus Cars. So there was a cars connection there, but it's a rally bike. So the highway. Okay, yeah, thanks. The AA was actually involved in the consultation before, and we were broadly very, very supportive of the changes originally. The one area we did question, to be fair, when it first came out, was actually more towards cars turning left and giving way to pedestrians, because there was no clarification about the type of road, and there were some questions if it was a fast-moving road, etc., etc. So we saw clarification on that. But in terms of, you know, hierarchy of road users and all the things Duncan talked about, we were very supportive, and we even tried to educate the media. I think that was GB News, and it could have been Anne Diamond and someone else who were very, very cynical about it and thought the AA would be up in arms, but we managed to put them right there. And then, you know, more recently, with Duncan's survey, found that 33% of people were unaware of those changes, and some had no intention of reading them. Again, we put out positive comments there. And I think, you know, a year on, there are some positive things going on. Certainly AA driving schools and BSM now have a module about the new highway code. So all learner drivers, at the very least, are actually getting well educated. And the fact that in the theory test and the practical test, you can actually be asked, and you are often asked on these subjects, I think that is a positive thing. And being someone who actually, some people thought I was cruel, but I sat in the back of my then 18-year-old son when he was doing his tests. Somebody said, how can you do that? And he did come across a cyclist on a country road, and he was so patient for so long. I was trying to kind of kick his seat to tell him not to overtake, there wasn't enough room. But, you know, so I do think learning to drive is one way where we can begin to change things. And I'm also quoting Ben Bradshaw there, showing the breadth of support. We did some survey work on various questions last September. So I guess when the Highway Code had been in 9 months, and some of them perhaps are quite surprising. You know, it's a survey of 12,500 drivers, and 93% said they did know the Highway Code had changed. They might not know the detail, but they did say that. It was interesting though, and those that said no, 5%, but amongst younger people, the proportion was actually higher. So despite me talking about learning to drive, there's more work to be done there. But then other things, when you say to drivers, local roads require more investment to make cycling safer, again, vast majority actually agreed with that. And this, we asked people whether they were more mindful of cyclists when driving than they were a year ago, just to try and ascertain whether the Highway Code had made a difference. You know, perhaps 40%, perhaps slightly higher than we thought, but 37% neither way, so it hadn't really changed them. We then tried to boil it down into some of what was seen certainly in the media as some of the controversial bits of the Highway Code. So we talked about Rule 66 and asked about being considerate to the needs of other road users when cycling in groups, but also explaining that you can cycle two abreast to be safer, particularly in large groups or with younger children or less experienced people. And again, did people agree with that? Well, actually, when it was explained, and I think this is the point that Duncan made, when it's actually explained, then you are getting 80% agreeing with that. Again, we asked about rule 213 on narrow sections of road, quiet streets, at junctions or in slow moving traffic. Cyclists may sometimes ride in the centre of the lane. And, you know, you can remember the headlines on the Daily Mail or whatever, cyclists in the centre of the lane, you know. So it was, this was really hyped. So we tried to explain why it was, and also talked about the Dutch reach and also for cyclists leaving at least the door's width from a parked car for their own safety. And again, there was majority agreement with that. Perhaps the most encouraging stat is when we did actually explain that you should only overtake when it's safe and legal to do so, and that you should leave at least 1.5 meters when overtaking at speeds up to 30 miles an hour. The vast majority of people, 90% almost, did actually agree with that. So again, when it's explained, you do get support. So it shows that we need to do more to get the message out there. And I just wanted to touch on one of the ways that at the AA, we've tried to get the message out there, and indeed we still are. And this was a Think Bikes campaign that we launched in 2014. It was the idea of one of our patrols, actually, when a friend of his was killed. And the simple idea that you have these stickers here and you put one on each side mirror. And every time you get into the car, when you look at that mirror, it just gives you that little reminder. And I've had it myself, pulling up to a roundabout, I've looked right, I've looked left. Then I've seen the sticker and kind of looked again, and there's a cycle coming. So it's that kind of psychological reminder. So we launched in the UK, also with the FIA, we launched in Brussels, and Eddie Merckx, legendary Tour de France cyclist, actually did his own video, which I was delighted with. And actually these stickers or versions of them have gone across 22 countries in Europe. So we're pretty pleased about that. We also had with it quite a cheeky video, and I apologize, there is a bit of nudity in this, but it's a very short video, so bear with me. You got sound. Should have been. That's great. Yeah, I can script it. That 5 million stickers via Halfords, and today all AA patrol vehicles still have these BSM and AA driving school bikes, and various fleets that we use still use these stickers. So, you know, it is a way at the AA we're still trying to remind our members to think bikes. I think it's very relevant to the highway code, and, you know, perhaps it's something that DOT could have done more on in terms of the imaginative campaigning to get the message across. But certainly we will continue to do so. And anyone who wants any stickers, tell me. Yeah. Well, they do. Yeah. Yeah. Thanks. Anyway, thank you.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Yeah, right. Okay, Andy Cox from the Met Police. You're on mute at the moment. Right. Okay. Hi, Andy.
everybody. Just for clarity, so I'm not representing the Met in essence tonight. I'm representing sort of national policing, just my role. So I don't lead on roads policing for London. I just need to put that clarity in from the outset. I suppose the questions I've got, and I really agree with the presentation so far and share a lot of the views, particularly Cycling UK, around some of the challenges that there's been so far. But I pose the question: what is success? Do we really know and understand what we're looking for here? Is it going to be evaluated? When? How often? Those sorts of questions spring to mind. I think there has been some marked changes, to be fair. We really sign up and agree with the 8 changes to the Highway Code, in particular hierarchy, positioning, both in the main, but also from junction exit as well. And the Dutch reach, I think, are the 4 things that we find more beneficial now, both from a deterrence and an enforcement perspective. But we just need to understand, still was 111 people died in 2021. I appreciate this is pre-highway code change, but that was the last data year that we've had. And I think it will be broadly similar in 2022 from the data I've seen. And obviously that's a shocking amount, and it's far wider than the highway code, which is why I sort of asked the question, what is success? Because this is far more wide ranging than just a highway code. So for example, legislation around things like exceptional hardship, things around enforcement of pre-crash issues such as extreme speeding. So I think there's a need to have a broader look, to be fair. Some of the changes, I think, just to build on some of what's been said, I think the 1.5 metre clarity has been really, really beneficial in terms of marketing. I think that did get people talking. I tend to share the views that Edge just talked through there around the type of people that, or the amount of people that now know there's been a change in the highway code, because I think that got people talking. But what are we doing to remarket that? How do we continue to build on that initial hit? I think when people did talk about it and it did have an impact, because I think people forget and it stays with them for so long. So we've got to constantly reinforce. And I don't really see, if I'm being honest, an effective marketing campaign around that. We do pockets of stuff. There's social media. There's lots of talking around it in certain networks. But I think more broadly, people will soon forget and perhaps have. And if I'm being honest now, from an enforcement perspective, we don't really see a change. And we still see, I think in some regards, a hierarchical order and the positioning actually led to some difficulties with drivers and cyclists from a culture perspective. So when a cyclist does take the centre ground, if the driver's not aware of the highway code change or doesn't sign up to it or buy into it, it arguably creates more risk. And as I say, that culture challenge comes in where drivers and cyclists evidently don't necessarily share the same view and share the same safety principle and so on. And for me, it still comes back to a fundamental culture challenge around the way we drive. There's too many people prepared to take an over or do an overtake, which is far too dangerous. They then wait at the junction, they wait at the red light, the cyclist catches them up, and it just goes on and on and on. And I think until we really fundamentally deal with that, then this will always be an issue. So whatever highway code changes we introduce, for me, it's just one pocket of a much bigger picture around legislation, around the wider marketing, the media, the role they play, and a much bigger, more collaborative, joined up stakeholder engagement to really tackle road danger. I think the highway, I suppose in short summary, the highway code changes we really sign up to, we agree, we like, but we recognise there's so much more to it that needs to take effect. And I think the points have been made really around the government influence and government voice around this. The 2.1 billion statement, there's an economical benefit, but there's obviously an emotional impact with 111 people dying. So it's how we get that across, continue to market that, continue to push for other changes, and to make people constantly aware by constantly reinforcing it. It felt to me and police and colleagues, it was a significant event, significant launch, but hasn't been followed up, and therefore it started to be diluted.
Sorry, thank you, Andy. And our final speaker is Sean Hellman, who's the Chief Scientist for Behavioural Sciences at TRL. And TRL stands for Transport Research Laboratory. I think I should have known that. Okay, over to you, Sean.
Hi, thanks. Thanks very much. So I was asked to come and give, I guess, a broader road safety view on this. Like the other speakers, I'd like to say up front, clearly these changes are really positive, and certainly TRL welcomes them from that perspective. But my presentation, very short, is intended to be a kind of reality check, really, as to what we can hope to achieve with what's been done so far. And I think we've heard hints from all the other speakers that this is a longer game than maybe we first thought. So if I just move on my slides. So I'd like to start by talking about something that I spend a lot of time thinking about, which is logic models. For those of you who don't know, logic models are just a sort of description of a chain of causes and effects that will achieve a desired outcome. And in this case, what we're talking about is the problem we have, which is vulnerable road user safety. We hope that by telling people some new information, that will prompt those people to go and learn that information and use it in their behavior on the road. And that's essentially all we're hoping to achieve here. Now, my basic assertion is that thinking about this, it's a perfectly good model of thinking about how we want to achieve the long-term goals, but the assumptions underpinning it, I wouldn't go as far as to say they're naive, but they're difficult to achieve. And what I'll talk through in the next few minutes is the fact that often in road safety, we find when we're trying to do things like this, that telling people about stuff is actually quite easy. It's the getting people to learn and use the information and change their behavior that is not. What I'll do at the end is just remind us, as somebody else has already mentioned, seatbelts, I think, in their slides, and I'd like to just reflect on what we can learn about the 3+ decades of communication we've done on drink driving, which is another good example. But will reset, I think, our expectations about what can be achieved and over what time frame. So how good is knowledge in road safety? Well, one sort of miniature study you can do for yourself next time you're speaking to someone is show them these 3 traffic light phases and ask them what they mean. In my experience, when I do this, almost nobody gives the correct answer. All of them mean stop. Most people assume the one in the middle means prepare to go or go if the way is clear. Very few people will give the right answer about the third one, which is particularly still stop, but obviously there are some caveats to that around, not if you're going to pull up so suddenly as to cause a collision. That's really interesting to me because that's such a fundamental part of the traffic infrastructure that you would expect knowledge would be rather good. There's a more formal case study. David Sheenar ran a study in the early 2000s looking at sign comprehension and found that even for signs local to the countries being tested, comprehension could be as low as 60% in the driving public. I've already heard Edmund talk about learner drivers. Interestingly, in this study, novices sometimes were outperforming older drivers. And again, I think Edmund mentioned this. We can imagine that being due to the fact that they have to know this information to pass their driving test. It's worth noting, however, that the driving test pass mark for the theory test in this country is 86%. I will invite the panelists and the audience to reflect on whether they think that is high enough. So, telling is easy, learning is hard. That's what we see across a range of different parts of the road safety evidence base. If learning is hard, behavior change is even harder. And actually, even if we have perfect knowledge, we know that we still don't get perfect behavior. We can illustrate this really simply using a single thing, and that's knowledge of speed limits. So in the research work that TRL has done fairly recently, actually, we've had a study where we've asked people what are the speed limits in built-up areas and on motorways. And we find that for those 2 road types, knowledge is pretty much 100%. Almost everybody that you ask will know those limits. Look at free flow vehicle data, however, and half of people are breaking those limits, which most of them have knowledge of. So that's just a simple illustration that this is about more than telling and learning. It's also about achieving that behavior change. So sort of summarizing in terms of the logic model that I showed you at the beginning, you know, these great changes to the highway code and the communications that have been done are first steps. There's much more support needed to get movement on, you know, getting people to do the basic behavior that we need, which is for them to read in detail about the changes and retain that information and hopefully change their behavior on the road. And of course, what we hope eventually is that we achieve those longer term impacts. I said I'd reflect on drink driving. So this is something there's been communications on in this country for at least 30 years, 34, 35 or so now. And what's really nice about this is when the authors of this report looked back and retrospectively considered that period of 30 odd years of campaigning to think about how it sort of fits nicely into distinct periods during which there were a range of different behaviour change mechanisms focused on, a range of different strategies for the communications themselves. And so what we have is a really complex set of communications over a 3-decade period. And what we see in the data, the survey data we have, which runs to the end of the 90s, is we see a steady drop over time in the number or the proportion of people reporting that they do drink and drive. So males, for example, all male drivers went from about 51% in the 1970s at the end. And by the time we track it through to the end of the 90s, it's down to about 23%. Now that survey data ends there. We don't collect those data anymore, but we do have KSI figures. We know that they have steadily been dropping over time, a little bit of a blip in the early 90s, but gradually coming down. So a really complex campaign over 30 years, you've seen a reduction, but not an elimination of the behaviour that you're wanting to change. And that's really my summary. You know, we need to reset our expectations here about what can be achieved. This is just the start, and there needs to be a lot more effort to move forward in supporting the learning that we need to happen and the behaviour change. So that's me done. Thanks ever so much.
So we've lost the chair. They've miraculously changed during that couple of minutes. So those who don't know me, I'm Selene Saxby, MP for North Devon. I co-chair with Ruth, and Ruth got called away. So I'm in charge of questions, which I've now, of course, promptly lost on my phone, whilst trying to actually track down the minister to find out why the Department of Transport didn't come to the meeting. But I haven't got the answer to that one. But I do have some questions from other people that are on the call. So first on the call is from Ian Helledge, who is a Conservative Friends of Cycling committee member and East Sussex County Councillor. And he wants to know if the experts in the room and on the screen think now is the time to introduce some sort of regular mandatory retesting, say every 5 years, to ensure every driver is safe to be in charge of a motor vehicle. Does anyone want to volunteer a response to that?
If I may.
Yes,
go.
thank you.
It's certainly not AA policy that to retest after 5 years, but to put it into context, I think driving, if you look at training that people do at work, and whatever work you do, clerical management, you do have refresher courses at work. One of the areas that I do think has actually helped with training is being speed awareness courses and various other courses. And in fact, often the case is made when someone's been on a speed awareness course, they obviously didn't want to go on the course. But often the feedback is, having done that course, I would actually recommend it to other people not speeding. So I do think in terms of enforcement, you know, more emphasis on those courses can be a way of reminding drivers. So, you know, if it's offences to do with cycling, if it's to do with driving too close to cyclists, you know, why not develop courses around that to get the view across? Because I think, as Sean said, it's not only knowing the changes, it's changing that behaviour and finding different ways to do it. So perhaps more emphasis on those courses would be one way.
And I wondered if Andy, if you had any thoughts on this.
I think so. I mean, Ed's just nicely summed up this speed awareness points actually there. But I think, if we're serious about change, which is that 4 to 5 per day statistic that died, and I think we would recognise the need to retest. Certainly, you know, I don't quite know the timeline. You know, that would be a real complex piece of work to work out. But I think if we're serious about making that change, we do have to put some form of additional refresher driving training standards, testing into policy, because actually it's about saving life and economical benefit as well, which we've already discussed. So, you know, I think there is opportunity to do that, and it might come, you know, as you gradually perhaps get older or whatever, we might look at phasing it in earlier, but I think there is certainly a need for some retesting.
Thank you. Fabian, did you want to come in to answer this or ask a different question?
No, not to answer. I wanted to ask a different question. I'm not one of the experts. So.
No, I'm not an expert either, but I'm quite in favour of it. And having done several speed awareness courses, I wish you could do them more often rather than getting points. They're very useful courses. But I also feel with the change of motor vehicles that actually the car has changed so dramatically, even in the time since I did my test, that it's a very different vehicle that I drive now to when I first passed my test. And that actually watching my parents, both of whom still drive, my mother's now driven badly for 50 years, that some form of retest might have been. Please don't record that, I'll tell my mother. Fabian, over to you, your next question.
Well, I've driven well for the last 50 years, but I passed my test 50 years ago, and I know it's not going to Edmund, thank you very much for those points. I think the speed awareness speed awareness course is very, very good. I've done speed over the years. You always dread them and actually come out thinking, oh, I've learned quite a lot. And they're not punitive either, but hello, good to see you too. What I wanted to ask though, our panel, especially our last speaker, I thought was really interesting about behavioural change, is why it is, do you think, that so many drivers really hate cyclists? And I mean, you know, I regularly do quite long cycle journeys, and I do fundraising cycle journeys. And at least once or twice in every 100-kilometre ride, I get abuse and somebody trying to drive me off the road, actually aggressively. Now, I don't know what we can do about that. Clearly, we can't police it enough. But I just wondered if anybody got any thoughts about how we can change behaviour with regard to cyclists. And the irony is, of course, when they tell you to pay your road tax, most cyclists are drivers and they do pay road tax.
Well, I'll have a go at that. It's a big question. There's a whole range of reasons why people behave in the way they do on the road. That there's all kinds of things to do, not just with the frustration that people might experience in trying to get somewhere and feeling like they're being held up by other road users, but also just a whole set of social psychology things around in groups and out groups. People just naturally have a tendency to want to belong to a certain group. It's a really, really big question. I personally think it comes back to something like a more comprehensive version of the drink drive change that we've seen. And that is a change of the way people just look at the culture of road use. So, you know, just getting people to a place where they can consider the roads as a shared space for everybody to basically be nicer to each other. That's what you're aiming for, and you don't get it through this piecemeal approach of just having courses for this or training for that. You have to bring all of that together under a single vision, if you like. I don't have the answer as to how you would achieve that, but I would suggest that it is a really, really big job, and it's something we should be looking to achieve over the coming decades, especially as transport changes out of all recognition with new modes and new shared services and all these kinds of things that are going to come into the mix. So yeah, really, really big job to do, but it is a behavior change thing. It's also a system thing, designing the system differently on top of that.
Before I come to you, Andy Cameron, did you want to come in?
Yeah, just adding to that point, I just think it's an important challenge we need to address, because when we want to build these active travel schemes in regard to transportation, then the road users just, you know, it becomes an us and them straight away. It's exactly what I want to avoid. Try and encourage people to want, because it's safer and as well lit, or whatever the reasons are, it's cheaper to do short journeys, you know, utility, going to school, going to work, for short journeys to choose to do it rather than make it as a net. You've got a scheme up, it just becomes a or particularly also in preventing our cars from going around, and that's a real challenge. Certainly isn't.
Could I possibly jump in on that one as well, if I may? I don't think I've heard many interviews which Edmund's been on where he hasn't tried to stress the point that he's has a job function involving a driving organisation. He's a regular cyclist. And it's a point I regularly make in all my interviews, that I work for a cycling charity and I own a car and I occasionally drive. And we try very, very hard to break down that categorisation of people as a cyclist or a driver. And we make a bit of progress, and it's often undermined, I have to say, by media reporting of incidents and the issue of the media narrative around this, and how that the good work is then reframed as a who's in the right, the driver or the cyclist. It's unhelpful to that. And it is something that we, I think, need to collectively try and see if there's something that can be done. There was some fantastic work undertaken by journalist Laura Laker a couple of years ago in relation to media reporting of road traffic conditions, to try and get some clearer guidance about how those things were reported and the language that's used. And if that could be moved forward, that would make a big difference to the narrative, because the reality is, I think 90% of our members have a driving license, which speaks volumes.
Andy, over to you. It's your hand up.
Oh, he's got into his connection.
While we're waiting for Andy, Ben.
Yes, I have a deep psychological explanation for that question. Sorry. I have a completely unproven, but deep psychological explanation.
To grow. But I do think it's similar to media. There's a role here. Hopefully you can hear me. Can you hear me now?
Can you hear you now?
Yeah.
We could hear you, but
Yeah, we can hear you, Andy. Keep going.
Sorry, I'm not sure how much you got of that. I've obviously got connection issues this end.
none of it. None of it.
You have to start,
Okay.
you have to start from the beginning, Andy. Sorry.
Okay, sorry for that. So I was just saying, totally agree with the media comments there that made in terms of their responsibility to market the whole subject correctly and to stop to turn it into essentially a culture war. I do think in terms of it's a real positive for the highway code, this in terms of the change, because I think that 1.5 metre issue has been reinforced and we need to continue to reinforce that. We do now have public road crime reporting nationally, and there's no more postcode lottery. It is available everywhere in the country. And I do think cyclists are really prominent in terms of reporting. And obviously the close pass issue is the most likely offence to be reported by cyclists. So I think that's a real positive. But I do think ultimately this comes down to a range of issues, some of which are segregation in terms of infrastructure, but also linked to media in some regards, the whole sentencing around this issue. So there needs to be perhaps greater understanding across the criminal justice system and more broadly everywhere in terms of risk that's posed if we're serious about tackling the 111 that die. So it does need, I think, a whole system approach, but that sort of culture change across the piece as well.
Thanks, Ben. Back to you.
Sorry, yes, no, I was just saying before we lost you that in terms of the question as to why so many drivers seem to hate cyclists, I have a completely unproven psychological explanation for this, which is that drivers really resent the fact that in urban areas cyclists are faster than them, almost universally. I mean, I can feel sometimes the rage as I glide past several meters, meter upon meter of sedentary traffic. I also think there are some cyclists who probably feed cyclists' impression of cyclists as being rather virtuous and smug, because we're being responsible and doing our bit for the environment. And then also exacerbated by the minority of cyclists who disregard the rules, the highway code. I think it's that combination of thing that creates this, which is then I think amplified by the media or by some of the media. But I don't know what you do about that really.
Very interesting point then, because actually as a pedestrian, I hate cyclists. Every day that I am here and I have to cross that road outside of here and endless cyclists. I know it probably is a minority, but it doesn't feel like a minority of pedestrian, particularly when I've got my dog with me. Break those rules and come across it. And it might not be for today's meeting, but if somebody at some point can make a note, we need to do something about these bicycles left all over the pavements, because not only will everyone hate cyclists while they're on their bikes, if we don't sort out these new bikes that are left everywhere, today in the wind, you can't get across the pavement in Westminster. And for those people who do need to walk and with dogs and everything else on pavements, it's, you know, we're not making any friends with our cycling behaviour in some circles.
But also, you stop at the traffic lights and you've got 2 or 3 cyclists next to you, but then 10 go past and ignore the lights. You think everybody thinks you're the same. And it's really frustrating. Ben's right.
Yeah, no, I think, yes, some cyclist training. Maybe we could have a cycling speed course, like the driving speed course, to improve our. For most of us, it's even longer since we did our cycling proficiency, actually. Really? That explains everything. That's why people shout at you.
I always obey the rules.
Okay, and from the screen, I've got a question from Tim Snazel, who asks, is it possible for the Department for Transport and other stakeholders, such as Bikeability, Cycling UK, the AA, Police, Fire Service, to sit down with the newspaper editors and news outlets to discuss why the changes are going in place and its guiding principle of safety for all users? Would this help get a positive reflection on the changes rather than a very polarised view, which then gets transformed into greater polarisation on social media? I think we should just ask Gary Lineker to do it. But any other suggestions?
I mean, we have tried various initiatives like that. I mean, we have done various joint letters, you know, from motoring groups, cycling groups, active travel groups to some of the media. But, you know, frankly, the media normally, when they phone up, you can tell what their agenda is, you know, and if they come to me about cycling, it's they've got a story and want to condemn cyclists for not being law-abiding, and they're sometimes a little surprised when I say, well, let's put this into context, you know, drivers are also cyclists. So, I mean, I think the Highway Code did show the media, you know, as I said, going on GB News, when I did it, they had a real agenda that was totally anti-cyclist. And they were somewhat surprised as they thought that I would reinforce that. So I think I agree with the question in the way that you've always got to question the media in terms of getting more clarity there, whether further joint initiatives would work. I mean, you know, when we launched this, all the cycling groups were involved. Chris Boardman helped us launch it. TfL were involved. The police were involved. You know, so we have had occasions where we put everyone together. So useful suggestion.
Thank you. And I've got another question from the screen from Silke Kennedy Todd. Does anybody on the call know what the Driving Standards Authority stands to alert drivers to the change?
Yeah, that's a good question, actually. That is a good question because, as far as I know, apart from new drivers, you know, in terms of, as I explained, taking the test, where there is a lot of information, not aware that anything's gone out to the system.
No, there hasn't been anything else sent out. And that gets to the previous question, I suppose, about retraining, which I didn't jump in on, but just as a general observation, it's impossible to imagine in another walk of life in relation to factory safety or somebody working in a building society or a construction site, somebody going through 30 years working with equipment without having some form of upgrade or refresh in relation to the training or the information that was provided to them about safety. We don't have that culture in relation to driving. I'm not saying that to say that the answer is X or that we definitely need this rather than this frequency. But I think the conversation about how we upgrade people's knowledge, awareness, and skill sets in relation to operating a piece of machinery that can be difficult, it can lead to the tragic consequences with others. We need to have that conversation about how that takes place, because we haven't had a situation where these changes have been communicated to everybody that drives. There hasn't been an email that's gone out to everybody to say these are the new highway code changes. the principle we're working on is that everybody is responsible for going back and checking on when this has changed. And I don't think that works in today's world.
So my next question I've got is Patrick Jarman. For Cycle Savvy Driving is an intervention designed by the Bikeability Trust, funded by the Department of Transport, which aims to educate learner drivers on understanding cycling behaviour and how to share the space on the road. It is currently in an expansion phase, the first phase having demonstrated some very positive outcomes. Thank you very much, Patrick. Unfortunately, nobody from the department is here to share that information with, but I will pass it on. I'm going to struggle with your surname, Tom. Tom Bogdanowicz, sorry, my pronunciation is poor. If car ads were to show responsible driving rather than open roads in the countryside, that might influence behaviour change. Can government influence the advertisers? No. But somebody else in the room might be able to.
Yeah, I mean, there was an actual ad in Germany some time ago. I think it was BMW. And you see the German guy coming out of his house, and he's got a nice 5 Series there, and you think he's going to get into it. And he actually gets onto his bike, and it says, the intelligent driver knows when to leave his car at home, and he cycles off. So, it can be done.
That is the end of the questions that I have. Is there any more in the room? And if not, it remains for me to apologise for Ruth for her untimely departure, and she sends her apologies to everyone in the room. And thank you to everyone for speaking again. It's incredibly interesting, and I think given the absence of the department at the APPG, maybe we could follow up directly. I have been in touch with the department to express our dissatisfaction at the late cancellation, to actually see what is being done and to really relay these changes, because they were important changes, and I think that it seems to be unanimous feeling that they haven't really reached the parts that all of the places should have reached, so to speak, or words along that line. And so what else we can do as an APPG, I think, to perhaps influence that, and maybe, Darren and myself need to take it on and actually go and nudge Richard Holden as to what happened this afternoon at the department, so that we can understand better what they're doing and what more all these other great groups that we're involved with can actually do to influence the situation, and try and get the word out there so that we can walk and cycle and drive more safely, which I think is ultimately what everybody wants. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you. Just add one thing. But we were hoping to get one today, but for understandable reasons, it hasn't happened. But I know that quite a lot of people have put in for an urgent question on the transport capital programme cuts, including active travel cuts for tomorrow, and there's a good chance of getting one. So if you could use your good offices to encourage our supporters to attend and potentially ask a question about active travel, that'd be really good.
Yeah, thank you.
Our next meeting.
Oh, sorry, thank you. I'm not very good at this. I'm out of practice. The next meeting is next Monday, so I'll see you all over again. And next week we're going to talk about walking at 4:30 p.m. I'm not sure where it is, but somewhere like this. It's in here, room F. Same sort of setup, all about walking, which I spent a lot of time doing in London at my 20,000 plus steps a day. So yeah, very much looking forward to a different mode of transport next week. Thank you all for coming today.